They told me my husband died in a tragic accident on a rain-slicked highway. I buried him with full military honors, holding his folded flag with trembling hands. But exactly 3 days after the funeral, my phone rang at midnight. It was his billionaire boss, and his voice was shaking with absolute terror. He whispered, "Clara, get out of your house right now. Do not trust your stepmother. Your husband didn't just die." He was silenced. In a fraction of a second, the people I called family became my most dangerous predators. I am a United States Army major, trained to survive brutal war zones, but absolutely nothing prepared me for the enemy smiling at my own dining table. To survive, I had to play the role of the perfect, broken widow, all quietly setting a trap that would burn their empire to the ground. This is a story about discovering that your greatest superpower is your resilience, and that true family is never determined by blood, it is determined by loyalty and respect. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic people to protect your own peace, you will want to hear exactly how this trap was sprung. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength. Now let's uncover the truth. They told me my husband, Nathan, died on a rain-slicked highway just outside the city limits. That was the official story, delivered by a solemn highway patrolman standing on my porch under a flickering porch light. That was the narrative I repeated to the military chaplain, to the funeral director, and to the flag-folding officer who pressed the heavy, perfectly creased triangle into Msins, like it was supposed to serve as an anchor for a life that had just been entirely uprooted. My name is Clara Hayes. I am 42 years old, a major in the United States Army. I have spent the better part of my adult life learning how to keep my hands perfectly steady when everything around me is falling apart. But nothing, not a single day in uniform, not the chaotic aftermath of 3 grueling overseas deployments, prepared me for the suffocating silence of an empty house. The funeral was a blur of black umbrellas and rehearsed condolences. I stood at the graveside in my dress uniform because I could not bring myself to wear anything else. It was an absurd instinct, the desperate belief that if I just stood at attention long enough, I could hold myself together through sheer muscle memory. My stepmother, Evelyn, cried loud enough that people 2 rows back turned their heads in sympathy. My stepsister, Beatrice, dabbed at her eyes with a lace tissue that never actually seemed to touch her face. I watched them through the gray mist of the afternoon with the same detached vigilance I used during reconnaissance missions, looking for the things that did not add up. Something felt profoundly wrong. It had felt wrong for years, if I was being truly honest with myself. But grief possesses a terrible power. It makes you generous with people you should not be generous with, and it turns your own survival instincts into background noise. I told myself it was just paranoia. I told myself that the sheer trauma of losing Nathan was making a liar out of my own intuition. 3 days after we buried him, my phone rang. The glowing numbers on the digital clock beside the bed read 12:14 in the morning. Nathan's side of the mattress was still perfectly made, untouched, as if some fragile part of my mind believed that if I did not disturb his pillows, his absence would not become permanent. I almost did not answer the unfamiliar number, exhausted by the endless stream of condolence calls from people whose faces I could barely remember. But a strange, cold prickle at the base of my neck forced my hand toward the receiver. The voice on the other end was low, controlled, and unmistakable. It belonged to Arthur Sterling, the reclusive billionaire founder of the private technology empire, where Nathan had worked as chief financial officer for the last decade. I had met him only twice, at formal company galas where Nathan had proudly held my hand. Arthur was a man who commanded rooms without raising his voice, a man whose time was measured in millions. Yet, in the heavy silence of the night, I heard something I never expected from a man of his stature. I heard genuine, unadulterated fear. Arthur did not offer pleasantries. He did not say he was sorry for my loss. He simply said my name, his voice tight and urgent. He told me to listen to him very carefully and to not interrupt. He told me that I could not trust my stepmother, Evelyn, under any circumstances. He told me to not say a word to my sister, Beatrice. He warned me that I was in immediate danger, that Nathan's accident was no accident at all, and that I needed to leave my house immediately. The line went dead before I could ask a single question. 17 years of marriage to a meticulous, numbers-driven man had taught me one undeniable truth. When someone that careful and precise breaks every protocol to call you in the middle of the night with a warning, you do not waste precious seconds asking why you move. I threw off the heavy blankets and dressed in the dark. I pulled on dark jeans, heavy boots, and grabbed Nathan's old canvas field jacket from the hook by the door. It still smelled faintly of his cedarwood cologne, a scent that threatened to break my composure right then and there. I grabbed my keys, locked the heavy deadbolt behind me, and walked out into the freezing damp of the night. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck the way I used to grip a rifle before a patrol, not out of panic, but out of absolute, cold readiness. The city streets were empty, slick with the remnants of an evening storm, reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights as I drove toward Arthur's private estate, entirely unaware that the life I thought I knew was already over. The iron gates of Arthur Sterling's sprawling estate opened silently as my truck approached, guided by unseen security cameras. The driveway wound through ancient, dripping oaks, leading to a massive stone residence that looked more like a fortress than a home. When I pulled up to the main entrance, the heavy oak doors were already open. Arthur stood in the foyer, looking significantly older and more exhausted than I remembered. But it was the man standing slightly behind him who caught my immediate attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver dusting his dark hair and eyes that swept over me with a familiar, quiet assessment. Arthur introduced him as Julian, his head of security. I recognized his posture instantly. It was the stance of a man who had worn combat boots, a man who understood the weight of a uniform. Julian was a former Army Ranger, and as our eyes met, an unspoken understanding passed between us. He did not look at me with the suffocating pity I had endured all week. He looked at me as a fellow soldier standing in the middle of a minefield. Arthur led us into a dimly lit study lined with books and heavy mahogany furniture. He poured a glass of amber liquid and slid it across the desk toward me, his hands shaking slightly. He explained that Nathan had been running a quiet, unsanctioned investigation into my family for the better part of a year. Nathan had known that something was deeply wrong with how my late father's estate was being managed, but as he dug deeper, he realized the rot extended far beyond simple embezzlement. Arthur confessed that Nathan had come to him weeks ago, terrified, asking for help to secure his findings because he believed his life was in danger. Arthur looked at me with profound sorrow and admitted that Nathan had hidden the final, undeniable proof somewhere only I would know to look. He hadn't entrusted it to Arthur. Knowing the tech firm could be monitored, he had trusted our secret language. The dam I had meticulously built over the last 11 days finally broke. The sheer magnitude of my husband's silent sacrifice, the agonizing realization that he had died trying to protect me while I was thousands of miles away on deployment, crashed over me like a physical blow. I sank into the leather chair, covered my face with my hands, and for the first time since the chaplain knocked on my door, I wept. It was a harsh, ugly, breath-stealing kind of grief. Arthur quietly stepped out of the room to give me space, but Julian stayed. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell me it was going to be all right. He simply knelt beside my chair, placing a warm, remarkably steady hand on my shoulder, grounding me in the present moment until the storm inside my chest slowly began to subside. His silent strength was the first real comfort I had felt since Nathan died. A quiet promise that I did not have this crushing weight entirely alone. When I finally lifted my head, wiping the tears from my raw cheeks, my mind began to race. Nathan's final clue. Only something I would know. I closed my eyes and thought of the day before my last deployment. He had handed me his grandfather's antique pocket watch, a heavy brass piece that no longer kept time. Evelyn had always mocked it as useless junk, but Nathan had told me it was my talisman. I stood up abruptly, the realization hitting me like a jolt of electricity. I reached deep into the pocket of Nathan's canvas jacket, the jacket I had blindly grabbed on my way out the door. My fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled out the tarnished brass watch, my heart hammering against my ribs. Julian brought over a small set of precision tools. With trembling fingers, I popped the back casing of the watch. There, tucked neatly behind the frozen, rusted gears, was a tiny, black micro SD card. We moved quickly to Arthur's secure laptop. When Julian plugged the drive in and brought up the files, the blood drained from my face entirely. It was not just bank statements showing stolen inheritance. It was a labyrinth of offshore accounts, forged signatures, and shell corporations. Evelyn and Beatrice had established a massive, fraudulent charity in my name. They were using my military rank, my combat record, and photographs of severely wounded veterans to solicit millions of dollars in donations from wealthy benefactors, funneling every single cent into their private accounts. They were exploiting the very people I had sworn to protect, wearing my face as their mask. And as the final audio file on the drive began to play, filling the quiet study with Evelyn's chilling, honey-sweet voice discussing exactly how much it would cost to make Nathan's brakes fail, my grief evaporated, replaced by a cold, devastating clarity. The audio file ended, leaving a toxic, suffocating silence in Arthur Sterling's dimly lit study, the sound of my stepmother's voice, callously calculating the price of my husband's life, echoed in my mind like a physical blow. For a long moment, I simply stared at the glowing screen of the laptop, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. The woman who had sat at my dining room table, who had held my hand at the funeral, who had pretended to mourn the man I loved, was the very architect of his murder. A hot, blinding rage flared in my chest, a fierce and sudden urge to drive straight to Evelyn's house and tear the truth from her bare hands. My muscles tensed. My breathing grew shallow and rapid, and I felt the dangerous, reckless edge of pure fury taking over. But before I could move, Julian stepped into my line of sight. He did not grab me or try to restrain me. He simply stood in front of me, a steady, immovable force. His dark eyes met mine, calm and deeply understanding. He recognized the combat adrenaline flooding my system, in a quiet, grounding voice. Julian reminded me that running in with nothing but rage would only give Evelyn exactly what she needed to destroy me. He told me that Nathan had sacrificed everything to hand me a weapon, and I needed to be a soldier now, not a victim. I had to let Evelyn think she was still winning. I returned to my empty house just before dawn, my mind operating with the cold, detached precision I usually reserved for war zones. I made a pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen island, and waited for the enemy to make her next move. I did not have to wait long. Less than 48 hours later, I woke up to a heavy, authoritative pounding on my front door. When I opened it, the morning light revealed two uniformed police officers standing on my porch. Behind them stood a man in a crisp medical coat, holding a thick leather binder, and hovering just behind the officers, dabbing her dry eyes with a perfectly folded tissue, was Evelyn. Her face was twisted into a mask of profound, agonizing maternal concern, but her eyes were cold, triumphant, and utterly predatory. The doctor stepped forward, his voice dripping with condescending sympathy. He introduced himself as a psychiatric specialist appointed by the county. Evelyn stepped out from behind the officers, reaching out a trembling hand toward me, softly crying that I had not been in my right mind since Nathan's tragic passing. She handed the officers a stack of forged medical documents, meticulously crafted papers detailing severe, unchecked PTSD from my military deployments. Compounded by the traumatic loss of my husband, the narrative was flawless, weaponizing my proudest service against me. The doctor regretfully informed me that Evelyn had filed for an emergency medical conservatorship. They were here to perform a mandatory wellness check, with the immediate intent of transferring me to a private, high-security psychiatric facility for my own safety. Evelyn had orchestrated a brilliant, ruthless preemptive strike. She knew I would eventually find the truth, so she decided to legally erase my credibility, my freedom, and my voice. If I was declared mentally unfit, Evelyn would gain total legal control over my life, my assets, and the fraudulent charity she had built in my name. I stood in the doorway, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had exactly 10 seconds to make a choice that would dictate the rest of my life. The soldier in me wanted to fight. I wanted to scream the truth, to physically push them off my porch, to demand they look at the evidence Nathan had died to uncover. But I looked at the police officers. Their hands were resting cautiously near their utility belts. They had already been briefed. They fully expected a highly trained, traumatized veteran to become violent and erratic. If I raised my voice, if I showed even a fraction of the righteous anger burning inside me, I would validate every single lie printed on Evelyn's forged documents. I would be handcuffed, sedated, and locked away. And Nathan's death would remain an unfortunate accident forever. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate down. I looked directly into Evelyn's calculating eyes, and I made the hardest tactical decision of my military career. I surrendered. I let my shoulders slump. I allowed my hands to tremble visibly. I let tears pool in my eyes, forcing my voice to break into a fragile, exhausted whisper. I looked at the doctor and said that maybe Evelyn was right, that I was just so overwhelmingly tired, and I did not know how to live without Nathan anymore. The officers visibly relaxed. The doctor offered a patronizing smile. But the most important reaction came from my stepmother. A fleeting, victorious smirk crossed Evelyn's face. She genuinely believed she had broken me. She believed the grieving widow had finally collapsed under the weight of her own sorrow. She had no idea that I was not breaking. I was merely retreating to higher ground, waiting for the perfect moment to burn her empire to the ground. For the next 4 days, I became a prisoner in my own home, playing the role of the heavily medicated, mentally fragile widow with absolute, grueling dedication. Evelyn moved into the guest bedroom to supervise my recovery, bringing Beatrice along to help manage the estate. They stripped my phone away, canceled my credit cards, and spoke to me in slow, soothing tones as if I were a confused child. Every morning, Evelyn handed me small white pills that I seamlessly palmed and flushed down the bathroom sink while running the faucet. In the evenings, I sat in the living room staring blankly at the wall, listening to them casually discuss the millions of dollars flowing into the Veterans Charity Fund. They were incredibly arrogant, blinded by their own perceived genius. They did not know that Arthur had quietly funded a sophisticated surveillance net, or that Julian had managed to slip a microscopic communication device into the seam of my slippers before I left the estate. Every whisper, every gloating confession Evelyn and Beatrice made in the privacy of my kitchen was recorded, logged, and securely transmitted to Julian, who was silently building an ironclad case alongside federal investigators. Evelyn could not resist the allure of a grand, public victory lap. By the end of the week, she insisted that I attend the highly publicized charity gala she had organized at the city's most prestigious hotel. It was the perfect stage for her masterpiece. She intended to parade me in front of 300 wealthy donors, utilizing my fragile appearance to garner immense sympathy. Before tearfully announcing that she was officially stepping in to manage the foundation due to my tragic mental decline, she spent hours having a team of stylists dress me in a pale, modest gown that made me look suitably pale and diminished. As she pinned a memorial ribbon to my chest, she whispered that Nathan would want me to rest and let her carry the burden. I simply nodded, keeping my eyes downcast, counting the hours until the execution of the final maneuver. The ballroom was a sea of expensive suits, sparkling diamonds, and clinking champagne glasses. Reporters flashed photographs as Evelyn guided me by the elbow toward the front table, playing the role of the devoted, heartbroken matriarch. I sat quietly, scanning the perimeter. In the shadowy corner near the exit doors, I spotted Arthur standing silently. And high above, in the darkened sound and lighting booth, I saw the faint outline of Julian. He gave me a single, imperceptible nod. The trap was set. The federal agents Arthur had contacted were already mingling in the crowd, posing as waitstaff and wealthy benefactors, waiting for the signal. When the dessert plates were cleared, Evelyn gracefully walked up the stairs to the grand stage. The room quieted as she tapped the microphone, her face a mask of elegant sorrow. She delivered a sickeningly sweet speech about sacrifice, military honor, and the tragic toll grief takes on the human mind. She pointed directly at me, her voice trembling with fake emotion, declaring that Major Clara Hayes had given too much to this country, and that it was now her solemn duty to take over her beloved stepdaughter's legacy. The crowd erupted into polite, sympathetic applause. I did not shake. I did not cry. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a sharp scrape that echoed over the applause. I walked with the measured, commanding stride of an army major, bypassing the steps and vaulting lightly onto the stage. I calmly took the microphone directly out of Evelyn's perfectly manicured hand. She froze, her eyes widening in sudden, unscripted panic. I looked out at the sea of wealthy donors and spoke, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. I told them that my stepmother was right about one thing. I had given a great deal to my country, which was exactly why I would never allow a parasite to exploit the men and women who had bled for it. I looked up at the sound booth. Julian hit the switch, the massive screens behind the stage, meant to display the charity's logo, suddenly flashed with damning, undeniable evidence. High-definition images of Evelyn's forged banking documents, offshore account numbers, and the secret medical conservatorship papers illuminated the ballroom. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Evelyn lunged toward me, hissing a threat. But the audio file suddenly blared through the state-of-the-art sound system. Evelyn's own recorded voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers, loudly and clearly discussing the bribe paid to the mechanic to tamper with my husband's brakes. The silence in the ballroom became absolute, terrifying, and profound. Evelyn's face drained of all color, her arrogant facade shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Beatrice began to sob uncontrollably from the front table. I did not even look at them as the undercover federal agents swiftly moved through the crowd, pulling out their badges and handcuffs. I handed the microphone back to my stepmother, looked her dead in the eyes, and told her she was going to need a much better lawyer. The ballroom descended into absolute pandemonium the moment the federal agents moved in, their silver badges catching the harsh glare of the chandeliers. The polished, elite veneer of the charity gala shattered instantly, replaced by a chorus of shocked gasps, murmured outrage, and the sharp, frantic clicking of camera shutters from the press who had been invited to witness my supposed downfall. 2 agents flanked Evelyn, securing her wrists in heavy steel handcuffs. For a fleeting second, she tried to maintain her aristocratic composure, attempting to charm the officers, demanding they unhand her, threatening them with lawsuits and the wrath of her high-powered attorneys. But as the cold metal clicked into place, the reality of her total defeat finally fractured her immaculate mask. Her face twisted into something feral and desperate. She screamed my name, a vitriolic, venomous sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, cursing me, cursing Nathan, and cursing the very uniform I had worn to protect our country. I did not flinch. I stood on the edge of the stage, my hands resting loosely at my sides, watching the woman who had tormented my family and ordered the murder of my husband being marched out the grand double doors in utter disgrace. Beatrice was weeping hysterically at the front table, her face buried in her hands, entirely ignored by the mother who had dragged her into this nightmare. Once the doors closed behind the police, the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright for days suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep, hollow exhaustion. The room was still buzzing with chaotic energy, but I felt completely detached from it, Floating in the surreal quiet of the aftermath, Julian materialized at my side, moving silently through the bewildered crowd. He did not ask if I was okay, he knew I wasn't, but he gently placed a warm hand on my elbow, steering me away from the flashing cameras and the probing questions of the wealthy donors. He guided me out a side exit, down a quiet service hallway, and out into the cool, sharp night air of the city. We stood on the sidewalk in the dark, the distant wail of police sirens fading into the city noise. I leaned back against the brick wall of the hotel, closed my eyes, and finally exhaled a breath I felt I had been holding since the night the chaplain knocked on my door. The war was over. The ambush had been perfectly executed, but as I stood there in the cold, the absolute finality of it all crashed down on me. Winning did not bring Nathan back. It only ensured that his death had not been in vain. The next 12 months were a grueling, exhausting marathon of legal proceedings, depositions, and federal indictments. The justice system moves with agonizing slowness, demanding that I relive the worst moments of my life in sterile conference rooms and crowded courthouses. The forensic accountants, led by the evidence Nathan had so meticulously gathered and Arthur had rigorously protected, dismantled Evelyn's entire empire piece by piece. They uncovered a network of offshore accounts, shell companies, and fraudulent tax returns spanning nearly a decade. Confronted with a mountain of undeniable evidence and the threat of spending the rest of her life behind bars, Beatrice immediately turned state's evidence. She sat in a wooden witness box, trembling and pale, and testified against her own mother. Beatrice detailed the exact timeline of the embezzlement, the creation of the fake charity. And the chilling moment, Evelyn realized Nathan was closing in on their crimes. Beatrice claimed she never knew about the plot to tamper with the brakes on Nathan's car, pleading ignorance to the murder itself. The federal prosecutors built a fortress of a case. When the final sentencing hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed, but the air felt remarkably still. I sat in the front row, wearing my dress uniform, flanked by Arthur on my left and Julian on my right. Evelyn was led into the room wearing a standard-issue federal jumpsuit, stripped of her designer gowns, her manicured nails, and her arrogant pride. She looked incredibly small, a hollow shell of the terrifying matriarch who had controlled my life for so long. The judge did not offer leniency, citing the egregious exploitation of wounded veterans and the chilling premeditation of my husband's murder. The judge handed down a maximum sentence, ensuring Evelyn would spend the remainder of her natural life in a federal penitentiary. Beatrice received a harsh probationary sentence and was ordered to pay massive restitution, escaping prison only because of her immediate cooperation. When the gavel finally fell, echoing like a gunshot through the silent courtroom, I did not feel a sudden, magical sense of joy. There was no triumphant parade in my heart. Instead, there was just a quiet, profound sense of order being restored to the universe. I walked out of the courthouse and looked up at the open sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face for what felt like the very first time in a year. Stepping into the new normal required a different kind of courage than the battlefield had ever demanded. For years, my identity had been forged in the crucible of military deployments, shaped by discipline, duty, and the desperate need to survive. But standing in the quiet aftermath of the trial, possessing complete legal control over my father's restored estate, and the foundation Nathan had died to expose, I had to figure out how to actually live. I started with the charity. I refused to let Evelyn's toxic legacy define something that bore my name and exploited my brothers and sisters in arms. With Arthur's generous financial backing and his vast network of resources, we completely overhauled the foundation. We stripped away the corporate greed and the hollow galas, transforming it into a genuine, boots-on-the-ground sanctuary for returning veterans. We built transitional housing, funded intensive mental health programs, and created a community where traumatized soldiers could find purpose, dignity, and brotherhood without being paraded around as props for wealthy donors. Every time I walked through the doors of our new headquarters and saw a veteran smiling, working, or simply breathing easier, I knew I was building the exact monument Nathan had always deserved. Through every grueling step of that rebuilding process, Julian was there. Our relationship did not ignite with the sudden, dramatic fireworks of a Hollywood romance. It grew slowly, quietly, taking root in the shared silence of two people who had seen the darkest parts of the world and survived. He was the man who brought me terrible diner coffee when I was buried under mountains of foundation paperwork at midnight. He was the man who knew exactly when to pull me out of a crowded room because my chest was getting tight, and the man who never once asked me to stop grieving my husband. Julian understood that loving a widow meant making room for a ghost, and he did so with a grace and security that continually left me in awe. One rainy Sunday afternoon, as we sat on the porch of the new house I had bought, a house filled with light and entirely free of Evelyn's memories, Julian reached over and gently took my hand. He traced the scars on my knuckles, his touch grounding and warm. In that quiet moment, leaning against his shoulder and listening to the steady rhythm of the rain, I realized that my heart, which I had believed to be permanently shattered, was finally beating in time with someone else's again. The journey to this quiet porch had taught me a profound, agonizing lesson about the true nature of family. Society conditions us to believe that blood is an unbreakable bond, an infinite contract that demands absolute loyalty, no matter how toxic, no matter how cruel. We are taught, especially as women, to be the peacemakers, to swallow our pride, to smile through the disrespect at the holiday table, and to shrink our boundaries so others can feel comfortable. But I had learned in the most brutal way possible that true family is not defined by shared DNA or legal documents. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering safety, and the fundamental human right to be treated with dignity. Blood does not give anyone the right to abuse you, to manipulate you, or to demand your silence. The people who truly belong in your life are the ones who protect your peace, who stand beside you in the trenches, and who love the scars you carry without ever trying to exploit them. Sometimes, I still take Nathan's grandfather's pocket watch out of my desk drawer. I hold the heavy, tarnished brass in the palm of my hand and run my thumb over the cracked glass. I think about the quiet, brilliant man who fought spreadsheets in boardrooms while I fought wars overseas. The man who gave his last breath to ensure I would not live in the dark. I no longer feel the sharp, suffocating agony of his absence. Instead, I feel a deep, enduring gratitude. He gave me the truth, and the truth had set me free. I had walked through the fire, armed with the evidence he left behind, and I had burned down the empire built on our pain. Now, as I look out over the life I have painstakingly rebuilt, the thriving foundation, the quiet mornings, the solid, unwavering presence of a man who loves me, I know that the mission is finally complete. I am no longer just surviving. I am living, boldly and unapologetically, in the light. I had genuinely believed the war was over the day the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse closed behind Evelyn. For 6 months, my life had settled into a beautiful, unfamiliar rhythm of peace. The newly reformed foundation was thriving, providing genuine sanctuary and robust mental health resources for returning veterans. My days were filled with purpose, and my evenings were spent in the quiet, comforting presence of Julian, whose steady love had become the bedrock of my new existence. However, the universe has a peculiar way of reminding you that true closure is rarely a clean, straight line. The reminder arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in the form of a secure, encrypted message from Arthur Sterling. Despite having officially retired and handed the reins of his technology empire over to his successors, Arthur still maintained a formidable intelligence network. His message was brief, requesting that Julian and I meet him at his private estate immediately. The familiar, cold prickle of adrenaline flared at the base of my neck as Julian and I drove up the winding, oak-lined driveway. When we entered the grand study, Arthur was standing by the window, holding a thin manila folder. He did not offer pleasantries. He simply turned around, placed the folder on his massive mahogany desk, and told us that the FBI had finally located Marcus Vance. Marcus Vance was the ghost in the machine of Nathan's murder. While Evelyn had orchestrated the hit and provided the financial incentive, Vance was the disgraced underground mechanic who had physically cut the brake lines on my husband's car. He had vanished into the criminal underworld long before the federal indictments came down, slipping through the cracks of the justice system while Evelyn and Beatrice faced the wrath of the courts. For months, his absence had been a lingering shadow over my healing, the one loose thread that threatened to unravel my hard-won peace. Arthur explained that Julian's former military intelligence contacts, working quietly in tandem with federal authorities, had tracked Vance to a dilapidated coastal town 300 miles north. He was living under an assumed name, working cash jobs at a rusted marina, believing he had successfully outrun his sins. The federal agents were mobilizing for an arrest at dawn the following day. But Arthur had used his considerable influence to get the information to us first. He looked at me with a profound, unspoken question in his eyes. He was offering me the chance to be there, to look the man who had destroyed my life in the eye before the heavy doors of a prison cell slammed shut on him forever. Julian did not tell me what to do. He simply stood beside me, his presence a warm, immovable pillar of support. He knew the psychological toll this would take, but he also understood the mindset of a soldier who needed to see the mission through to its absolute conclusion. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the rough paper of the manila folder, and I felt a profound shift within myself. Months ago, the discovery of this man would have ignited a blind, reckless fury inside me. I would have wanted to tear him apart with my bare hands to balance the scales of my grief. But as I looked at the grainy surveillance photograph of Vance, I did not feel rage. I felt a cold, unyielding demand for absolute justice. I turned to Julian, my voice perfectly steady, and told him to pack a bag. We were driving north. The journey up the coast was blanketed in a thick, gray fog that rolled off the freezing ocean. Julian drove in comfortable silence, his hand occasionally reaching across the center console to interlock his fingers with mine. He did not ask if I was sure, and he did not offer unsolicited advice on how to handle the confrontation. That was the beauty of the love we had built. It was rooted in an unwavering, mutual respect for each other's strength. As we pulled into the sleepy, salt-stained town just past midnight, the reality of what was about to happen settled heavily over me. I checked into a nondescript motel with Julian, but sleep was entirely out of the question. I stood by the window, watching the distant lighthouse beam cut through the fog, thinking about Nathan. I thought about his quiet brilliance, his gentle smile, and the horrific terror he must have felt in his final moments on that rain-slicked highway. I was not doing this out of hatred anymore. Hatred was a poison that Evelyn had thrived on, and I refused to let it infect the new life I was building. I was doing this to reclaim the narrative. I needed Marcus Vance to know that the woman whose life he had been paid to destroy was not a victim hiding in the shadows, but a warrior who had survived the fire and emerged strong enough to watch him burn. The air at the marina was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, rotting seaweed, and cold salt spray when Julian and I arrived just before dawn. We parked our vehicle a discreet distance away from the rusted corrugated metal garage where Marcus Vance was known to sleep. We were not alone. Hidden in unmarked vehicles scattered around the perimeter, a tactical team of federal agents waited for the precise moment to strike. The lead agent had agreed to let me approach first, under the strict condition that Julian, armed and vigilant, remained exactly one step behind me. As the first pale rays of morning light broke through the heavy cloud cover, the metal door of the garage groaned open. Marcus Vance stepped out, a lit cigarette hanging from his lips. He looked older and far more pathetic than his file suggested. He was a small, worn-down man, shivering in a cheap jacket, entirely unremarkable. It was sickening to realize that someone so small could cause such catastrophic devastation. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly toward him. the gravel crunching loudly under my heavy boots. Vance froze, his hand dropping toward the pocket of his jacket. But the sight of Julian's massive, imposing frame stepping up beside me made him freeze entirely. He did not recognize me at first. He squinted through the morning fog, a flicker of nervous confusion crossing his face. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him, close enough to see the deep lines of paranoia etched into his skin. I did not yell. I did not draw a weapon. I simply introduced myself as Major Clara Hayes, the wife of the man he had murdered for a handful of Evelyn's stolen money. The color drained from his face so fast it was as if he had seen a ghost. He took a stumbling step backward, his cigarette dropping to the wet concrete. He tried to speak, tried to formulate a lie or a plea, but the sheer, overwhelming weight of his guilt silenced him. I looked him dead in the eyes and delivered the final blow, not with my fists, but with my absolute, unshakable survival. I told him that he and Evelyn had tried to bury me, but they had fundamentally failed to realize I was the seed, as the federal agents swarmed the dock, pinning him to the hood of a rusted truck and reading him his rights. I turned my back on him. I walked away without looking over my shoulder, leaving the ghost of Marcus Vance in the hands of the law, entirely severing the final chain that bound me to the past. Returning to the city felt like walking out of a long, dark tunnel into brilliant, blinding sunlight. The chapter of vengeance and investigations was permanently closed, allowing me to pour every ounce of my energy into the foundation. A month later, we hosted the grand opening of the Nathan Evans Memorial Wing, a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center designed exclusively for veterans suffering from severe combat trauma. There were no wealthy, superficial donors looking for photo opportunities. The room was filled with the men and women who had worn the uniform, people who understood the invisible wounds of war. As I stood at the podium to cut the ribbon, I looked out at the faces of my chosen family. I saw Arthur, smiling with quiet pride. I saw the veterans whose lives we had already helped rebuild. And in the front row, I saw Julian, looking at me with a love so deep and grounding it took my breath away. That afternoon, as Julian and I stood in the quiet garden behind the new facility, I finally understood the profound lesson this grueling journey had taught me. True empowerment is not just about surviving the unthinkable. It is about having the courage to keep your heart soft in a world that desperately tried to make it hard. The manipulators, the users, and the toxic people who demand your loyalty under the guise of family will always try to convince you that setting boundaries makes you the villain. But walking away from abuse is the highest form of self-respect. We possess the fundamental human right to surround ourselves with people who honor our dignity, who protect our peace, and who celebrate our strength rather than being intimidated by it. Nathan's sacrifice had forced me to confront the darkest corners of human greed, but it had also led me to the purest form of love and purpose. I took Julian's hand, feeling the warm, solid reality of our shared future, and for the first time in my life, I knew with absolute certainty that no matter what battles lay ahead, I would never have to fight them in the dark again. The transition from surviving to truly living is rarely marked by a single, miraculous leap. Rather, it is a quiet, daily practice of choosing hope over the lingering shadows of fear. 6 months after Marcus Vance was taken into federal custody, effectively closing the final, grueling chapter of my husband's murder, I found myself navigating the strange and beautiful terrain of an ordinary life. My new home, a sprawling, sunlit farmhouse situated just outside the city limits, had become my ultimate sanctuary. It was a space entirely devoid of Evelyn's toxic influence or the suffocating memories of the betrayal that had once defined my existence. On a crisp autumn morning, I stood by the large bay window in the kitchen, a steaming mug of black coffee warming my hands, and watched the golden leaves drift lazily onto the damp grass. Julian was outside, chopping firewood with the effortless, rhythmic strength that characterized everything he did. I watched the steady rise and fall of his shoulders, feeling a profound, grounding sense of peace that I had once believed was permanently lost to me. He paused, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow, and looked up at the window. When his dark eyes met mine, a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, and my heart gave a familiar, joyful flutter. It was in these small, unremarkable moments that the true magnitude of my victory revealed itself. I had not just survived the destruction of my old life. I had fought for the absolute right to build a new one, filled with light, safety, and unwavering respect. Later that afternoon, Julian and I drove into the city to visit the Nathan Evans Memorial Foundation. The headquarters was buzzing with a quiet, purposeful energy. We had recently launched a new initiative specifically designed for female veterans returning from combat deployments, recognizing the unique, often overlooked challenges they faced when reintegrating into civilian life. As I walked through the brightly lit corridors, a young woman named Sarah tentatively approached me. She was a former combat medic who had been severely wounded during her second tour, and her eyes carried the same haunted, exhausted emptiness I had seen in my own reflection so many times before. She nervously twisted the hem of her jacket and confessed that she was struggling to believe she deserved to heal, that the guilt of surviving while others had perished was consuming her from the inside out. I did not offer her empty platitudes or clinical advice. I simply reached out, gently her trembling hands in mine, and told her my story. I told her about the suffocating darkness of betrayal, the agonizing weight of grief, and the paralyzing fear of moving forward. I told her that healing does not mean forgetting the people we lost or the scars we carry. It means honoring their memory by refusing to let the darkness win. I saw the tension slowly leave her shoulders, her eyes filling with genuine tears of relief, and I knew that this profound, shared empathy was the greatest weapon I possessed. The foundation was no longer just a monument to Nathan's sacrifice. It was a living, breathing testament to the resilience of the human spirit. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in brilliant strokes of violet and gold, Julian and I sat on the wide wooden porch of the farmhouse. A cool breeze rustled through the oak trees, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Julian reached across the small distance between us and pulled me gently against his side. I rested my head on his broad shoulder, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of his heartbeat. We did not need to fill the silence with words. The profound connection we shared was built on a foundation of absolute trust and mutual understanding. He had stood beside me in the darkest, most terrifying trenches of my life, never once trying to control my healing or dictate my path. He had simply offered his unwavering strength, reminding me that vulnerability is not a weakness, but the ultimate expression of courage. As I sat there in the fading light, completely wrapped in the safety of his embrace, I realized that the invisible wounds of my past had finally closed. The scars remained, a permanent roadmap of the battles I had fought and won. But they no longer caused me pain. I had reclaimed my narrative, dismantled a corrupt empire, and discovered a love so deep and grounding that it had entirely rewritten the trajectory of my life. I was no longer a soldier fighting a solitary war against ghosts. I was a woman standing firmly in the present, deeply grateful for the beautiful, unwritten future that stretched out before me. The anniversary of Nathan's passing arrived exactly 1 year after the gavel had fallen in Evelyn's federal trial. The day dawned remarkably clear and bright, entirely devoid of the gray, oppressive mist that had characterized his funeral. For weeks, I had quietly anticipated this milestone, bracing myself for a sudden resurgence of the paralyzing grief that used to leave me breathless. Yet as I woke up in the warmth of the sunlit bedroom, with Julian's arm draped protectively across my waist, I felt only a quiet, profound serenity. I carefully slipped out of bed, leaving him to sleep, and dressed in simple civilian clothes, a soft cashmere sweater and comfortable jeans. I was not wearing my military dress uniform today. I no longer needed to armor myself against the world, nor did I feel the desperate, irrational need to stand at attention to prove my strength. My strength was no longer a rigid, unyielding shield. It had evolved into something far more flexible and resilient, deeply rooted in the knowledge that I had fiercely protected the honor of the man I loved while simultaneously reclaiming my own soul. Julian drove me to the cemetery just before noon. He parked the truck near the wrought iron gates and simply squeezed my hand, offering me a soft, understanding smile. He knew I needed to do this part alone. He promised to wait for as long as I needed, an unwavering sentinel ensuring my total peace. I walked slowly along the manicured gravel path, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs with every deep, even breath. When I reached Nathan's polished granite headstone, I did not fall to my knees. I did not weep. I stood tall, the sunlight warming my face, and placed a single white rose on the cool stone. I spoke to him in the quiet sanctuary of my mind. I told him about the thriving foundation, about the hundreds of veterans whose lives had been fundamentally transformed because he had the quiet, meticulous courage to uncover a devastating truth. I told him about the beautiful, peaceful home I had built, and I told him about Julian, the remarkable man who had helped me find my way back to the light. I thanked Nathan for the immense sacrifice he had made, not just to protect my assets, but to protect my fundamental right to live a life free from manipulation and deceit. As I stood there in the absolute stillness of the cemetery, I felt his presence not as a heavy, sorrowful ghost, but as a warm, comforting blessing. The chapter of my life that belonged to Nathan was eternally sacred, but it was finally, peacefully closed. Walking back toward the truck, where Julian leaned casually against the door waiting for me, I reflected on the agonizing, transformative journey of the past 2 years. The most profound lesson I had learned was that true equality and human dignity are not merely political concepts. They are the absolute, non-negotiable foundations of any authentic relationship. Society often weaponizes the concept of family, demanding blind loyalty to toxic bloodlines while excusing horrific emotional abuse in the name of tradition. We are conditioned to shrink ourselves, to endure disrespect, and to sacrifice our own mental well-being to maintain a fragile, fabricated peace. But I had burned that toxic illusion to the ground. True family consists of the people who fiercely protect your boundaries, who celebrate your autonomy, and who stand beside you when the rest of the world turns dark. By walking away from the poison of my stepmother and stepsister, by refusing to let them use my grief as a weapon, I had broken a generational cycle of manipulation. When I reached the truck, Julian reached out and gently pulled me into his arms. I buried my face in his chest, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of cedar and clean cotton. He kissed the top of my head, holding me with a quiet, fierce devotion that made me feel invincible. We climbed into the truck and drove away from the cemetery, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. As we merged onto the highway, heading back toward our farmhouse, our foundation, and our shared life, I looked out the window at the vibrant, endless expanse of the world. I had survived the worst betrayal imaginable, navigating a labyrinth of deceit and danger, only to discover that the greatest victory of all was not just bringing the guilty to justice, but having the courage to open my heart again. My name is Clara Hayes. I am a veteran, a survivor, and a woman who fiercely claimed her right to a beautiful life. The darkness had tried to consume me, but it fundamentally failed to realize one crucial truth. I was always meant to be the light. As the heavy courtroom doors closed behind my stepmother, sealing her fate, I realized something profound about the silent battles we fight in our lives. From a young age, society conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable, sacred bond of blood tie that demands infinite sacrifice, constant compromise, and unconditional forgiveness, no matter the cost to our own mental health. But this grueling journey taught me that blood is merely biology. True family, the kind of family that honors your spirit, nurtures your growth, and protects your peace, is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect, safety, and absolute trust. When the people who are supposed to protect you become the very people you have to protect yourself from, walking away is not a betrayal. It is not a sign of weakness, and it does not make you a bad person. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. Many of you listening right now might be fighting your own invisible wars behind closed doors, dealing with manipulative individuals who weaponize your empathy and use your grief for their own gain. They will always try to convince you that your boundaries make you the villain. But I want you to remember this. Defending your peace is your fundamental human right. Healing does not mean forgetting the scars, and it certainly does not mean leaving the door open for those who actively plotted your downfall. Healing means having the courage to step out of the darkness and rewrite your own ending. You have the power to dismantle the toxic structures built around you. Do not let anyone convince you that you are weak. You were never meant to be a victim in their story. You have always been the hero of your own. This content has been researched, developed, and edited manually by us to provide meaning and lessons.